Okay, so I'm going to start out, like he said a little bit earlier, I am presenting on containers. I'm working with a customer right now where we've deployed our containers, not into full production, but we do have a dev test in production, and we're starting configuration and stuff that way. So we're kind of over the main hurdles of getting things installed. Haven't fully worked it in production yet, but that's kind of the scenario that we're at right now. So kind of start things out. Thought I'd play this little video. Hopefully you guys can hear.
The good, the bad, the ugly.
So I just kind of wanted to throw that out there, more so that Phil has to like keep that song inside of his head for the rest of the evening or whatever that way than anything. But thought it was kind of good to see where that comes from. So I'm a little bit more interactive with things. My presentation is probably not as polished as the rest of the presentations we've had tonight, but I'd like to make sure you guys are kind of participating, asking questions. I want to kind of make this interactive, kind of go over some of our experiences. So if anything I put up on the screen triggers a question or a thought or additional comments, feel free to jump in and go that route. Kind of really don't have a full agenda on this, just wanted to kind of give you some of our experiences and proceed that way. So I'm actually going to start backwards instead of the good, the bad, and the ugly. I'm going to start from the ugly, and we'll move into the bad, and then we'll go back to the good, because overall, I would say the containerized experience has been a good experience, and definitely something I would recommend you going forward. But there has been some challenges and some different things that way that I wanted to hit on. So we kind of define the ugly as things that are different, learning curve, kind of high level that way, just making it a little bit more difficult to implement and things that way. So a couple of highlights with that is installing containers is a totally different installation methodology, and I'll kind of pull some of that out. But first thing you've got to realize is there's actually two components that you're going to install. The first is a platform, that they're calling it the platform, and that's going to have everything like RSSO. It's going to have some of your back-end stuff. Dashboards comes with the platform. It's kind of building what they call the converged platform. So it'll actually be leveraged by TSOM or BHOM now, and along those lines. So getting the platform installed and down is actually a slightly different process than install an ITSM. So you'll kind of have those two components. And that was kind of a confusion right at the very beginning, is, you know, what do I install first? How do I launch things in that scenario? So if you're running into that, you definitely got to lay down the platform first, because that's where your RSSO and everything else is going to be. And then ITSM pulls a lot of the configuration settings from the platform installs and kind of runs with things that way. So the second is going to be ITSM. So the platform is actually deployed with a deployment script. You basically, it's kind of cool. They've actually got a shell script, an SH file that actually unzips everything and builds out your whole platform just from a shell script, which is kind of interesting. And then you can set up your configuration files, run that, and build out the platform containers and everything associated with it. Then the next step is going to be ITSM, and that is installed using Jenkins pipelines. So again, the learning curve here, you know, the script isn't too hard. Most of us have run different scripts, but Jenkins and pipelines and all of that kind of fun stuff is kind of something you're gonna have to figure out and learn. And the documentation from BMC is kind of there, building that out, but actually running them and how those all kind of function or work is definitely a learning curve. Another thing you got to get used to is once everything's up and deployed, everything becomes ephemeral, or a lot of stuff is ephemeral. So where you're used to having a server and dropping files on different servers, you now have pods that if you put a file out there on the pod, you restart that pod, that file disappears and is gone. And so that kind of makes logging and stuff interesting that way. But that's actually kind of a good thing. BMC's provided some good tools around logs too, and I'll talk about that here in a little bit. The other thing that's kind of confusing or different for me was networking. So I think most of us are used to having load balancers and stuff on the front end, but we now introduce a concept of an ingress controller, and then Kubernetes in general just does a bunch of networking stuff on the back end. So communication sometimes becomes problematic. So the pods generally communicate pretty well between each other, but anytime you need to integrate something from outside or provide access from the outside, that starts to become a little bit more difficult. Not that you necessarily need it the way that everything's architected, but it's just understanding how that network communication is happening and stuff like that. It definitely caused some confusion as we were installing and working that route. You're going to have to learn Kubernetes. So there's kubectl commands that can work. You're going to have to understand YAML file structures and start to become familiar with that, and kind of figure all of that out. And then this one I kind of debated on the infrastructure side, whether this is a bad or an ugly. I don't know that it's necessarily bad. It's just something you need to be aware of. It seems like right now, at least, it requires a lot more resources than a normal Windows server, or server client architecture type install. I just put some examples out there. Our production environment, we're running 168 virtual CPU, got 800 gigabytes of RAM and 7.7 terabytes of storage to run all of that. And then all of our environment together, and this also includes discovery. We're running true site automation, orchestration, and true site monitoring and stuff that way. Also have client management, and this is dev, test, and production, but everything all built out is 550 virtual CPUs, 2.1 terabytes of RAM, and then 31 terabytes of storage kind of built out that way. So just a couple things from the ugly, and I don't know if that triggered any thoughts or questions, so I'll kind of open it up right now. Any thoughts or questions related to containers and some of the ugly things? And I guess that's another question too, of Bob, it sounded like you guys have kind of started installing. Do we have anybody that's in the process of installing, or where are people at?
Yeah, Cade, we haven't actually started an install. We're actually trying to determine what that infrastructure will look like. That's why Matt Burley is on here. I'm gonna let him speak up to that. Yeah.
My immediate question, I'm experimenting with the platform at this point, trying to get things I think that need to be in place. Now, when you're talking about dev, test, and prod, are you talking in namespaces, or is this actual separate clusters, or?
So we did set up separate clusters, and I'll get into this in a little bit here, for each environment. So you're actually going to have, you can do it with namespaces as well, but generally you're going to need 2 or 3 namespaces, at least 3 namespaces for just a production install. So you have a namespace for your platform, you have a namespace for logging, you have the namespace for ITSM. So yeah, so you're going to want, we architected, and again, you can kind of architect it a million different ways, but we architected it so that we had separate clusters for each environment, and then within those clusters we had the predominant namespaces to run that cluster, or to run that environment, kind of architected there. That makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It does. Thank you.
Okay, and we'll get into that here in a little bit. I do talk about platform here a little bit. But another question?
Okay.
Yeah.
So what physical so did you actually go and procure bare metal hardware to put this on, or is this in the in the cloud somewhere? I mean, where did you install this stuff?
Okay, well, that actually kind of moves into the next sleight of thing. So here's some of the bad, the heartache and the pain with all of this. And we'll kind of get into the platform and talk the platform. So first heartache and pain with this is you guys really, need a Kubernetes expert, or you need to have one or somebody become one. And that person's got to be in charge of your platform and fully understand the platform. In this particular environment, so I have attempted a bare metal install, but I am still working on the bare metal install. The reason I'm still working on the bare metal install is because in that type of environment, you then have to worry more about networking. You also have to worry more about storage. And the big struggle we have in our bare metal environment, and I'm hopefully circling back and got this one resolved, but storage requires, or the persistent storage requires some auto provisioning of the storage and different things that way. And that's been kind of a challenge or a hurdle for us to overcome, because we don't know that environment, don't know how to figure that out. And so we think we finally got it figured out to be able to dynamically provision persistent storage in the bare metal. So I'm hoping this weekend to actually go back to the bare metal and try that out. We've had really good luck with TANZU. So the customers actually, we were fortunate enough that the customer I'm working with had a very strong VMware team, and they were willing to pay for the licensing and infrastructure to use TANZU. And I've got some other slides that kind of show how that infrastructure works, but I would say the advantage to TANZU is that then all of your networking and all your storage burden falls onto the VMware guys, and VMware actually makes it fairly simple. I mean, they're used to managing storage for VMs and stuff that way, and it really simplifies that piece of it. Now, our VM guys did struggle quite a bit with the networking side of it, and probably had some lessons learned there. I'm not a VM expert there. I do know that they worked quite a while and had to get VMware on the line in order to figure out some of that networking stuff. But once it was set up in VMware, we really didn't have to worry about it on the Kubernetes and our deployment side of things. So right now, based on the knowledge that I would have, if you've got an opportunity to go with TANZU and you've got some VMware guys that are willing to jump into that realm, that would be one of my recommendations to kind of avoid some heartache and pain, because like I said, we're still struggling on the bare metal side of things. And I think you're going to run into a little bit of that even if you do VMs or something along those lines. I haven't played around with OpenShift. I have heard some people have some better luck with that, but I don't know if that eliminates some of the networking or the storage issues that we have with setting up the infrastructure, if you will, for our Kubernetes environment. So that kind of answer the question, Phil?
Yes, thank you, Cade.
Yeah, and we have not attempted or tried to do it into a cloud type environment. I think it'd be a lot easier there, again, because your network and your storage are kind of handled by that cloud side of things. So that would be another option that would, but if you're going to go into the cloud, it seems like it'd almost be worth just having BMC stand you up an instance in their environment rather than go through all the work of trying to manage your own public cloud or whatever that way. So the other issue that we've had is, this is new for BMC. So they're trying to document, and honestly, their efforts at documentation are a lot better than some other companies I've worked with. But it is, or has been, in a state of change. And because it's so new, it probably makes sense to the people that were documenting it, but a lot of times it makes no sense to you or to me until you've done it. Once you've done it, then it's easy to circle back. Oh, this is what they wanted, and we're trying to do in the documentation. Or we've also found that there's still references to, on-prem 2002 type stuff, and they haven't quite documented how it works in 21.3 on-prem, or sometimes the documentation is on stuff in SaaS that doesn't really apply to doing it on-prem type of scenarios, or they don't give you the full details on how to do it because all of that documentation was normally handled by VMC. So the documentation is just contact your SaaS provider, BMC is the SaaS provider, the SaaS support, and they'll take care of it kind of for you. So I think it's getting a lot better, but that was kind of pain and heartache for us as far as that's concerned. Then the other pain point, and we're still kind of experiencing this, is the support people are still trying to get up to speed on it. Engineering and the back office guys, they understand the tool and they've been working with it, but your normal tier 1, tier 2 support, they're used to supporting it in a SaaS environment or the old on-prem capabilities. So in the SaaS environment, BMC could actually jump in and, they were the ones looking at the pods. They were the ones configuring certain things, doing all the back-end configuration. So they had a lot more power. So when they try and if a SaaS guy tries to support you, they can't do what they used to be able to do. They're having to talk you through it. And if it's a normal on-prem guy trying to provide you support, he's not as familiar with the containers and stuff that way. Again, this is just kind of a timing thing. I think they're getting more and more up to speed on that. But that was one of our pain points related to support. And then the other pain point for us, this client is installing a hybrid solution. So they're wanting to run digital workplace and business workflows in the cloud. Moving to 21.3, that type of solution kind of goes away because of the converged platform. We think we've got a solution for it, but that there's things that are kind of going away that are not supported in the converged platform as easily or not even necessarily needed. But BMC's been good to kind of help us with that scenario. But that's one thing that's kind of changed. We're also using client management. So some of that capability, now that we're going to progressive views, not all of that capability has been ported over into the progressive views side of things as far as the integration with Smart IT. So we lost a little bit there. We've got replicated reporting. This client wants to have a replicated database to run all the reporting off of. So with the move from smart reporting off the dashboards, I mean, that's kind of the dashboards is a nice thing, but the replicated reporting isn't there yet. BMC's working on it, but that's one thing that we're still kind of waiting for in this environment. And then we do have cloud discovery, but it's interesting that the discovery doesn't really know how to handle the containers too well. You can connect it up to Kubernetes, you can see the pods and do different things that way, but it doesn't do the application mapping per se. So it doesn't know this pod is talking to this pod, some of those communication paths and stuff that are a little bit more obvious in a server environment where you actually have processes and stuff running. So far, that isn't quite available in as far as we've been able to tell this way. And BMC does, again, they are working to get discovery working better on that. But that was one of the, like, I think Phil brought it up earlier, you want to be able to map out your own application discovery mapping, and it's been kind of tough for us to map out ITSM in the containerized environment due to the limitations of discovery and that communication that way. So,
hey,
so
Cade,
again,
are you running discovery in a container or discovery running
currently we're running just the
virtual
appliance
appliance
version. Yeah, we haven't run it into the containers yet.
Okay, thanks.
So any questions on this? And you guys have kind of, we talked about the platform choices, et cetera, but I'm interested to hear some of your feedback to how's your support been, et cetera, as you guys have been deploying it.
So Cade, I'm going to ask you a slightly different question.
Okay.
And this came about with a conversation with Lenny, where he was dealing with the Helix and SaaS environment.
Okay.
And one of the things he kind of ran into, the old way you would have multiple AR servers in a server group. And he was saying that what he was seeing, even though supposedly he has the multiple Kubernetes pieces running out there, multiple AR servers, it wasn't showing him that they were in a server group. It was acting like it was just one. Have you seen anything like that? Or
No,
understand it?
It still behaves exactly like, and I'll show you here in a minute some of the pods that are running. So out of the box, I think there's 6 or 8 AR server pods that it starts up in the environment, and we've got the actual list here. I'll show you in just a minute, but all of those show up in the same, as far as application or server group ranking forms and stuff that way. You'll see those in the server group rankings. You can prioritize and tell where you want, Pentaho to run, for example, set it as a default or different things that way. I'd be interested to see what Lenny saw, because yeah, I'm seeing, even your centralized configuration settings, there's individual settings for each one of the pods running in there. I mean, again, a lot of stuff they set more at the enterprise level, but yeah, it seems to be behaving just like a normal server group as far as I can tell.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any more on the bad?
So another piece, I talked with BMC because we developed a lot of custom things around our ITSM suite. Mm-hmm. And knowing that things are moving to progressive views, and we want to leverage that right away when we finish our upgrade. But there's no way I've got time to turn all of my custom stuff into progressive views and roll this out timely. And so I was reaching out to them to try to understand how our users will be able to go into the progressive front end of things and then still reach back to those custom items. The only option that they presented to me was, there's a more option up on the when you bring up the ITSM suite. Mm-hmm. Was to add entries into the more over there and then point it to the old style, not the smart IT style mid-tier, so that they would come up. Have you come up with a different solution or?
Well, yeah, so again, all of your old style mid-tier stuff, if they're using that, then that's still available and the customizations are there. So I'm assuming with the number of customizations you've got that you haven't been leveraging smart IT too much. Is that a correct statement?
Yeah, we've not had smart IT running at all.
Okay.
We're our first run of it is when we put this up with the progressive views. Gotcha.
My recommendation probably would be just stay with your classic view for a while, maybe not launch smart IT initially until you're ready to do smart IT, because and get all the stuff converted over to the progressive views, depending on how much it's going to be or how much custom you really have.
Yeah, it could take me a couple of years probably.
Yeah, I mean, again, you're going to have to prioritize and focus, and maybe you need Agility Suite to kind of capture all your ideas and your stuff that way to make it a good project. But you could link back into it, but I mean, if they're going to be in it anyway to do all the functions that they need to, why not start there? I mean, it's kind of, and all of the classic ITSM stuff works great as far as I can tell. The progressive views has made it nice because now we can, this customer is actually doing a lot of out of the box stuff. So we're fortunate in that scenario. I haven't had to take it, to a customized environment and try and.
Yeah, for our ITSM suite, ITSM products, we are very heavy out of the box. Okay. Most everything we've done custom have been extra forms that we've done to wrap around the ITSM.
Gotcha. Yeah, so the only concern I have right now, I haven't played, so more definitely worked in the old smart IT view, but in progressive view, that client management integration stuff was all supposed to show up in the more button, and BMC's telling me that the more isn't working and wasn't made available in the progressive view, but I haven't tried that. I haven't tried to configure the more stuff. So if you're using the progressive views and the more isn't there, then you're kind of messed up that way. But if you're using progressive views, I don't see why you can't develop a button or do something along those lines to do the same types of links. So you can at least link into the other form. It won't have that same look and feel, but you should be able to at least link into it and make something happen that way.
Okay.
So I don't think you really need to rely on the more with the progressive view, because that was kind of a kludge for the old Smart IT to make things happen. And maybe LJ's got some better feedback on that, but that's been my experience so far.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, any other questions on the bad? Okay, so here's some good reasons to go to it. So I had the installation methodology listed as an ugly, and that's just a learning curve issue. Once we figured it out and it's working, you know, we kind of went backwards because we had all of the like client management and the TSOM and discovery. This client only had licenses and server hardware, honestly, for those in our production. So we actually built out production first so we could try and start those integrations earlier. Hindsight, I would probably still do those in dev because they all can connect to multiple environments. So we probably should have done dev first, but we actually probably went through 15, well, probably more than that, probably 30 plus runs of the pipelines and the deployment as well, just to try and figure out all the networking, all of the dependencies and stuff that we needed to do there in the first environment. But the second environment, probably 2 or 3 runs, and then the third environment, a single run, and everything was up and running and working perfectly, you know, once we got all the kinks ironed out and understood the script. So the scripts do work once you figure them all out. And then patching seems to be really easy as well. You download the latest images and stuff for the containers, and the patching seems to deploy fairly easy that way. It's also fairly easy to enable additional capabilities or functionality using the Jenkins and stuff that way, once you learn how to do it. So again, I'd say the installation methodology is kind of painful to learn, but once you learn it, it does kind of make sense, and you can kind of troubleshoot and stop and start and deploy little individual components that failed, et cetera, that way. So it's actually a good, even though it was listed on one of the uglies, more from a learning curve. I also listed everything, or the fact that it's ephemeral, as a positive as well. So you don't have to worry about blowing away a pod. So if you blow away a pod, there's what they call stateful sets, and some deployments will actually monitor that pod, and as sees it disappear, it'll go ahead and spin up another copy of that pod and basically restart everything for you. So if you're lazy and don't want to restart individual services or processes, you can just delete the pod. It'll come right back up, and it's like basically performing a reboot or whatever that way. And then BMC's also provided,
don't give Matt Burley easy outs on my side there, please.
Again, I haven't run this in production. I don't know how much fun it'll be deleting pods in production environment, but so far in this environment, we've been able to do that, and it's been fairly painless. So they've also provided tools because things are ephemeral. They had to provide some methodologies for you to save your logs and stuff off. And that methodology, and I'll show you some screenshots here, but that methodology makes it easy to get at a bunch of logs, ship them off to BMC, et cetera. As long as you don't worry about scrubbing or doing stuff that way, it's pretty quick and painless to zip everything up and get a bunch of logs and get them over to BMC. And then the main reason that you're going to want to implement is the features. You know, things have been fairly static with 2002. You're just getting patches. You're not getting any of the whiz bang cool stuff that's coming forward. So, you know, out of the box, you're going to get the progressive views. You're going to get chat. You're going to get Innovation Studio. It is licenses for business workflows, but it's capable to run on-prem. We're excited about maybe installing BHOM on-prem as well. This client's not quite there, but with some of the difficulties we've had with TrueSight and trying to integrate TrueSight into this, I think BHOM is going to be a much better option for us. The Converge platform is really starting to show some of its power. So what that means is Digital Workplace Advanced, for example, no longer has to do a user sync between the two environments to keep things up. It's using the exact same people profiles. I'm hoping it's going to start leveraging the CIs a little bit more in Digital Workplace rather than having its own, what do they call it? My stuff and things that way that's kind of totally outside of the CMDB. And then we are getting new capabilities and new features, you know, even within the last couple of patches and stuff that way, that the development's obviously there at the 21.3 level or the containerized level. That's where they're putting the focus. So that's where you're going to get all the future enhancements. So
did you connect directly to the BMC repo, or did you have your own local harbor that you just do incrementals from, or how did you do that?
We stood up our own harbor, and the main reason we did that is we wanted to be the capability to scan the images just from a security standpoint.
Right.
The repository wasn't that hard to set up. The only thing I would say with that is it does take a bit of space in order to download that full repository. So we're constantly trying to purge stuff out of there in order to make room for the new stuff and be available, like when we need to patch or whatever that way.
Did you make the harbor a container, or did you run it on a real hardware?
We stood up 2 VMs, one to run Jenkins and one to run the harbor repository.
Okay.
So those are 2 virtual machines run on Linux that we stood up for that. So we didn't try and run it in the containers. We just stood up on I don't know, there's not a reason you couldn't. I mean, because you actually have to install Docker and stuff like that on those, but that's the instructions that BMC had, so that's the route we followed. We might change the architecture in the future, but it also made it easier to store all the files and stuff too, because we had a local file system to do that. So yeah.
So then is the synchronization between BMC's repo and your local harbor, is that automated, or do you turn that on and off, and then from your local harbor to your, as you say, you know, be able to scan your files before you deploy them? Obviously you can selectively do that, right? But are they both selective, or is one of them always automated, or what's the connection between those?
So we usually manually launch synchronization. Again, we didn't want to have things automatically going and changing and doing that. So when we're ready to do a patch or something along those lines, we'll clear out whatever files we need to, and then we'll run the Docker synchronization that way. We've also found that BMC kind of changes some of the naming structure of the repository. A couple times we had to add some of the extensions on it in order to get the right stuff. So I don't know that you're always going to have everything 100% in sync if you just do automated that way. We're still in the process of setting up our scanning, but the intent is probably to scan them not as they're being deployed, but as they come into the repository, the scanner will run through and check everything, and then they kind of sets them as cleared kind of scenario on the repository, and then we would deploy from that. So I think the process is going to be, you know, synchronize, make sure everything's scanned, and then run our pipelines in order to deploy and update everything that we needed to update that way. So I don't think we
kind of give you your own little DMZ type of a area where you can, you know, analyze, sanitize, you know,
right,
let things in or out. That makes sense.
Yep. Yeah, so that's kind of how that's worked so far. Any other questions? Okay, and again, this is a customer side, or else we could do some demos. So I'm going to be completely a slide man today, so that's why hopefully the questions make it more interesting for you guys. But for those that aren't familiar with it, this slide I think's kind of disappeared out of some of this image has disappeared out of some of BMC's documentation, but I really liked it. It gives you a good picture of what the architecture should kind of be like. So again, the harbor repository, the deployment engine, and the deployment manager, the deployment engine and deployment manager, we put on the same physical server. Really the deployment, what they're calling the deployment manager is just the script that you download and it extracts a bunch of stuff, and then you run an installer script to basically lay down the Helix platform. So that needs to get laid down first. So you can kind of see that on the screen where it says namespace BMC Helix platform. It's kind of sitting over all of the data tier stuff. That deployment manager will actually lays down the data tier. So it's going to lay down Postgres, Kafka, Zookeeper, Elasticsearch, and I think they've thrown a couple of other things in here now too, related to that. But that becomes, and sometimes that's referred to as ADE. So sometimes you'll see it in the documentation as ADE or the platform, but all of that stuff gets laid down by that deployment manager script. And once it's laid down, then you're going to use the deployment engine. Well, and you see a tie to that Harbor repository on both of them. So you, like Phil was mentioning, you could have your deployment engine and your deployment manager connect directly back to DTR. And I think we actually tried that initially, but ran into SSL errors and so a couple different things that way. So that was another reason having the local repository just kind of made it easier. The repository was able to communicate, download everything, and then we were more easily able to communicate with our local repository than trying to get both of those to go out and talk to the DTR. But the deployment engine and those deployment scripts both need to talk back to either the repository or the DTR in order to deploy everything else out. And I don't know if the documentation's gotten better. I think they've put a little bit more documentation around the ingress controller. But there's a specific way that ingress controller needs to be deployed. The original documentation just kind of said, hey, make sure you have an ingress controller. But they've updated the documentation because we were having a couple issues with certain pods not deploying quite right. And it turned out to be the settings and stuff for that ingress controller. So pay attention to getting your ingress controller set up and deployed before you start deploying all of this other stuff, because the platform and the ITSM will be dependent on that ingress controller working correctly. So on the right hand side, the database is the main database. So either the Oracle, or I think there was a question on here earlier about, are they supporting Postgres? You can set up a Postgres. I haven't done that. We chose to actually go with SQL Server, kind of from a licensing and a replication standpoint. We thought that was going to be easier. And at the time, BMC was also saying, SQL Server is what we're running in the cloud. So if we ever did decide to switch off of on-prem back to a SaaS, we didn't want to have to go through that database conversion. So we went with SQL Server for this environment. We've got the smart reporting database out there. Somebody told us that we needed to have it there because it did some checks, with the deployment, but we didn't actually deploy smart reporting because this is going to be a new environment. And with it going away, we thought we'd just go 100% with Helix dashboards. So we've got that there. And then we did deploy a replicated database in preparation for when BMC's got that replication all kind of figured out and get that set up. So that's a little bit different. And then we really haven't had to worry too much about the persistent volumes. Again, that's all been taken care of by TANZU. DNS and the load balancer, really there's only one load balancer in front of all of this, at least in the TANZU environment. And it really isn't doing any load balancing because we're all pointing to the same IP address for the ingress controller and kind of working that way. I think it'll be a little bit different in the physical hardware environment because I think it's going to load balance across all of the servers and the nodes. But in the TANZU environment, really the only thing the load balancer is doing is providing our SSL cert and then the different URLs and stuff for that. And then a lot of what we're doing is just URLs with DNS. So because it leverages the same endpoint IP address in the ingress controller for almost all of the different URLs that are required. then ingress does its magic and kind of redirects things to the right ports and right pods and stuff that way, based on where things are coming in. So, okay, any questions on the architecture? Have you guys seen this slide before, Bob, or was it Matt? That was
I have.
Yeah, I grabbed a copy of that one and put it in some of our own local documentation as we started talking this stuff and, and everything. So we had a question up here. Jorge asked, which version would you recommend is the one with the less bugs to start? And I think it's relevant as whether you're starting from scratch, Jorge, or if you're upgrading. I think there's a difference.
I would start with the latest and greatest version. They've obviously worked out more bugs for that, and the documentation's better for that. So we started with 21.3.0.0. We patched our production environment to 21.3.0.2. Well, I think we actually ended up doing a fresh install with 21.3.0.2 because we were having some really issues with 21.3. 21.3.0.4 is where we're at right now. It's the latest. They're working on 21.3.0.5. Sorry, I said 21. Yeah, so 21.3 because they went backwards, right?
Yeah, they went 21.3.
Yeah, 21.3 is actually newer than 21.0.5. So
yes.
So 21, you want to be 21.3. So 21.3 patch or whatever you want to call it, 04 is what the current latest and greatest is, and that's what I'd work off of that documentation, and that's what I would install. I wouldn't do the 21.05 or the 21.3.02 or any of those. But
yeah, and if you're upgrading Cade, it's my understanding that if you're on 20.02 for on-prem, that the upgrade would work to the 21.3.02 or greater on the patching.
So
that you wouldn't have to go the 21.05 to get there first. Am I reading that right?
There's not really, I'm not aware of an upgrade path.
Well,
so,
well, I guess it's not really an upgrade path. You still have to use the Helix Data Manager to
yeah, you're gonna have to migrate all your data over there,
right?
So there's not really an upgrade.
But there was something about you had to get to 20.02 in order to be able to use the Helix Data Manager to do it right, or something to that effect. Was the impression I was getting from the documentation I read.
So the Helix Data Manager, and I haven't done a ton of this, but it's supposed to support older versions and stuff just fine. I think the only disconnect you might have, well, even there, I mean, 1908's got, is the big thing that they started introducing was, you know, some of the group permissioning and some of those kind of things that might not transfer great over with the data manager, but I think the data manager is supposed to be able to support some of those earlier versions. But obviously, the closer you are, the easier and better things are going to be. So I wouldn't say it's a bad thing to be at 20.02. I wouldn't, and you want to be at 21.02 just from a supportability perspective anyway, too. Yep. So, but I don't know that it's a requirement. Yeah,
excuse me.
I can't answer that for sure.
And then Joe asked, do you know of a white paper on how to do the silent install for Postgres? LJ, we'll probably throw that back to you at some point.
Yeah, and that would be on the 20.02 side of things. So no, I don't know that one. So.
Hey, Cade, you keep, so when Bob was talking about, you know, the architecture and things and about like server groups and stuff, he was talking about different servers. You kept saying, oh, pod this, pod that, and you were looking at all this pod. And so my question is, are you equating a pod to a server and a server group, or are pods all of those little boxes in there that you showed on your last slide?
So no, so, and I'll show you some more slides here in a minute with some of the pods, but you're going to have smart IT pods, you're going to have AR server pods, you're going to have mid-tier pods, you're going to have, so all of the stuff that you're kind of used to, there's pods for RSSO. So all of the main components that you're kind of used to from a server perspective, those all now become pods. So I was originally under the impression that, you know, you were going to have a Tomcat pod that then the mid-tier ran on, but that's not quite how it worked. It really aligns more with the physical servers that you're used to building out. So, you know, you'd have 6 or 7 mid-tiers or whatever. There's going to be 6 or 7 pods performing the mid-tier function. And
Okay.
AR server, you're used to having 5 or 6 AR servers. There's an admin AR server pod, and then there's AR servers set aside for the smart reporting capability. There's AR servers set aside for integrations and FTS and stuff that way. So it really aligns more to the servers that you're building out, is how the pods kind of line up. Again, there's some additional pods you'll see too for the platform, but as far as ITSM is concerned, it really aligns to what you're used to seeing with servers.
Okay, and for scaling now, I mean, one of the things I heard that I understood about this whole benefit of this architecture is that Kubernetes can manage the scaling. So if there's a higher demand, it can spin up, I guess, more pods, right?
Yep.
And then as the demand lines down, it can just kill them off, right? In addition to obviously for like you know, just recovery, if one gets corrupted, like you're saying, you just kill it, or it kills itself, or it dies. Do those magically just? I mean, do you tell Kubernetes, hey, you know, start with 1, but go to 10, you know, or 100 if you need it? I mean, is that how this whole thing works?
So in theory, yes. I haven't seen any orchestration that kind of monitors, you know, to say, hey, once I start seeing these get this busy, start to spin those up. I'm sure there's something out there. We haven't gotten that far to that need or requirement just yet. And again, we're going to be kind of limited based off of our physical infrastructure capabilities, right? We may not be able to scale too much, but we haven't needed to yet so far. But again, we're not in production either. So it's very easy to manually do it. And I'll show that here in just a minute, to say, hey, I need another mid-tier. It's basically just saying, so there's a stateful set, and then there's deployments. Those deployments kind of manage those things. And in both of those, you can just say, I want to have 1 of these, or I want to have 0 of these, or I want to have 10. So that's another way that I shut down the environment. I'll just set my platform, you know, so my AR server stateful sets to 0, and then it shuts down all of the pods for AR system, and nothing's connecting to my database kind of scenario. So, but I haven't run into an orchestration that's monitoring the health of the environment and saying, oh, these pods are getting too busy. I need to spin up another one of them. Not to say that it's not out there. I just haven't done it. I haven't seen how that's been implemented yet.
Okay, I'm interested to see what Discovery does, you know, when you do this, because then you're saying that Discovery has a hard time seeing some of this stuff. We're seeing it right now in managing some of the data stores for some of the AWS, you know, servers, not with the containers, but how AWS will spin up a bunch, you know, and then Discovery finds them, and then we go and then they're gone, you know, that kind of thing. So I'd be interested to see how Discovery, if Discovery can see these pods and what it does when they spin up and spin down and blah blah blah. So anyway,
yeah. So and just to be clear, so we connected into Kubernetes using the Discovery connection to do that, and Discovery is picking up each one of the pods. So it's aware of the pods, it's aware of some of the namespaces and stuff that way. And if we spin them up or whatever, it keeps track of those. Where we're running into difficulty is it doesn't know that Tomcat is running in one of those pods, and that it's got this service. It just sees the pod. It doesn't see, hey, I've got Tomcat listening on 443 and it's talking back to this AR server over, you know, port 46262 is what they use in this environment. So it doesn't have that knowledge. It's not able to get all of those mappings in there. But as far as discovering the actual what's running, it's doing that okay. It's just not doing that mapping out of the connectivity to say this is my application, you know, in the current state. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, yeah, and part of the thing, I'd be interested to see what Howard has to say about this, right? Because part of it is Yeah, yeah, we run into the same thing too. You know, I see I see the machine, or I see it in the instance, I see the host, right? But I
Yep.
can't go the pod as a host. I'm assuming the pod will be the host
Yep.
computer system. But if it can't authenticate, or if it's having a hard time communicating, if the port's closed or whatever, right, or authentication, then it won't be able to see all the software instances and database and all that kind of stuff. So yeah,
But
that
what's
makes
kind of
sense.
interesting, I mean, the credentials we gave it do allow it to kind of get into the pod, and I'll show that here in just a second,
Okay.
you know, to be able to do some of that stuff. But for some reason, again, BMC is working on it, but it just doesn't have that knowledge of the communication paths and stuff like that it does from a normal OS perspective. But they recognize that as a deficiency, and they're working towards it. So
Okay.
like
Thanks,
everything, things are coming along. So real quick, I just wanted to go over the TANZU environment. So TANZU is kind of interesting. It's actually Kubernetes running on Kubernetes to some extent, that's running on VMware. So VMware just basically took Kubernetes in order to provide all the infrastructure. So it makes it a little bit confusing because it calls things namespaces. But those are really namespaces within VMware that they can then grant out to a developer or whatever that way. So we actually, what we're responsible in deploying is up in the top right-hand corner where you see the TANZU Kubernetes cluster. The VMware guys basically just gave us a production namespace. And we actually, again, carved it out kind of at this TANZU namespace level, which is that kind of second line, not the big square box up in the right-hand side. We've got a production namespace in each one of those, or a production, a dev, and a test namespace in each one of those that have all their own networking and stuff, and kind of isolates things there. But once they gave us that namespace, we were actually able to give all the commands and stuff to stand up our Kubernetes cluster. And then once that cluster was built, then we built out the namespaces that BMC needed, which you kind of see next to that little Kubernetes gear up at the very top kind of scenario there. So that actually, that's where we built our, you know, platform namespace, our logging namespace, and our ITSM namespace all got kind of built out up in that area there. But the segregation really kind of makes sense. You know, our VMware, because I'm managing these bottom 3 lines, and then they gave us that namespace, and then we were able to build out the cluster based on the resources allocated to that namespace, and then, you know, basically have full control of the cluster and all of the namespaces within that cluster to be able to kind of deploy things out. So again, one of the reasons I'd recommend TANZU is that this infrastructure made it so that, you know, the VMware guys took care of all of the infrastructure, and then they just gave us something to build out a Kubernetes cluster in that we pretty much had full control over, and we're able to build all that stuff out. So any questions on TANZU? This little diagram. Okay. If you haven't seen it, this is the Jenkins pipeline. So again, this is just an application running within Docker that helps orchestrate the deployment of the different pods and stuff that way. BMC tells you how to set it all up, gives you the pipelines, which are basically the instructions or scripts to install things. And each one of these are components. So the interesting thing with this is there's the main deployment is the Helix. I always get two mixed up. The Helix platform deploy. So again, they're kind of using words that are intermixed here a little bit. But then it does the on-prem deployment, the non-platform deployment, and the interops and stuff like that. It'll kind of run through each one of those automatically by launching that first one. Actually, I think it was the Helix on-prem deployment is the one that kicks everything off. And then it launches all of the other things automatically. But you do have the capability, if you want to do just one of the components, if it failed or whatever, you can just restart one of those components and kind of run with that. Then this next slide, I don't know if I can zoom up on it a little bit. Let's see if I can. I don't know how to zoom in the actual slide mode, but maybe we can get big enough here to kind of see that. But in the deployment itself, you can actually see where it's deploying. Make it a little bit bigger. So each one of these are either jobs or pods that are getting deployed. So this platform admin, that's the admin servers getting stood up. The platform FTS, that's standing up the platform FTS. And platform user, that's standing up a user AR server. You can see it rebuild the mid-tier cache. Then it builds out the web containers. The web containers are going to actually be mid-tier. I think it does the smart IT, some of those all on those web containers. And then it circles back and does more stuff with FTS and user. But it's kind of fun to kind of watch through each of these. These have got really fast times on it because it was after we'd already deployed them multiple times. It was just seeing that the pod was already there. And so it kind of ran through them pretty quick. It does take a little bit longer on the first installs on some of these. But back to your question, Bob, it actually sets server group ranking on all of them. So again, stuff that you're kind of familiar with doing, kind of are seeing there. And then there's another view of this. This is called Blue Ocean view. So it's kind of the same type of things, but it kind of shows some of this stuff kind of runs in parallel or has to all occur before it moves on to the next step. So this is just another view of that, those same tasks kind of going through the pipeline and the deployment there. So any questions on Jenkins and the pipeline from what we presented? Okay, another tool that I wanted to show you. So the cool thing about Kubernetes is you can start to leverage some of the Kubernetes tools. So we actually installed this dashboard tool, and this is running in our environment as a container. It's not running on a server, but it's called Kubernetes dashboards. And it gives you a graphical view and allows you to do some of the things like stopping and starting pods that you can do from a command line, but the graphical view makes it a lot easier. I'd say the only downside to this though is the permissions that you granted are pretty powerful. It's almost like root to your whole Kubernetes environment. So, well, you can grant less privileges, but to be able to do everything you want to do, you're basically giving people full access to all of your servers. You can delete the whole namespace, do all of that kind of fun stuff right from this web console. So it's pretty powerful and could be dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. But it also makes it so that you can work through a lot of stuff. So this is actually looking at the, look at it again, I think this one was, yeah. So this is actually looking at the platform namespace. So just the platform itself is running 72 pods. So it's got 32 replica sets. So each replica set will usually spawn 1 or 2 pods related to it. I think there's some that might have as many as 3, but not too many go above 3 or 4 in the standard install. Deployments are kind of the same thing. Those are deployments, and the replica sets manage the different pods, and that's where you control how many of the pods get deployed, et cetera, that way. I also, I should go back to a full slide now that we go to slide. I guess you can't see them quite as well on that. You'll have to kind of let me know, but this one was actually the platform. I don't know. I thought I took a picture of the this one. So this one's actually the ITSM. So in ITSM, it's only got 29 pods running for ITSM. So the ADE or the platform is a little bit bigger footprint. And I think if you look at the sizing recommendations and stuff, it's using like 100 CPU, and the platform's running about 40 or 50 CPU required to get, or the ITSMs run the 50 CPU to get it going. But this Kubernetes dashboard thing is really nice because you can kind of drill into the different states there. So here's listing, and this is what I was going to kind of show you. Each one of these is a pod. So I filtered this down to the platform pods, which are what you would normally consider an AR server. So it's labeled platform-SR. That's a smart reporting platform. INT is for the integration services, points kind of integration stuff there. User is a user one. FTS is actually the main kind of admin one. But if you notice, there's an SR1, and then there's also an SR0. So there's two. Yeah, there's the SR0, the user 0. So there's two instances of each of those capabilities. So you'll, again, kind of from a server group perspective, kind of what you're used to seeing, kind of the different functions and stuff that are out there. And we're understanding once we do a replicated database that we'll probably point these SR1s back to the replicated database rather than to the main database. And so that those AR servers will become that interface between the replicated database and the reporting platform. But that hasn't actually been implemented yet, so don't quote me on that one.
What's the difference, Cade, between the platform-user and the platform-SR? Is the SR your AR server and your user the mid-tier?
No, they're all AR servers. The user ones are generally tied to the user-facing mid-tiers. And
Okay.
then the SR one, I don't think it has any mid-tiers pointed to it. It's mainly used for smart reporting to be able to, you know how smart reporting has to go through an AR server in order to be able to do all this. So that's what that one's used for, is to strictly use do the AR or the smart reporting functions. And then FTS is kind of labeled funny, but it seems to be running most of the admin functions and Pentaho and stuff that way. Integration, we run more of your integrations and stuff that way through those servers and kind of expose it. So all of these are AR servers. I don't think I showed a mid-tier, but a mid-tier, it actually says mid-tier in the name of the pod.
Well, and I see off to the right, the middle column there, the bottom one is I see the last name of it is ARS-213.
Yeah,
Obviously
04,
blah,
yeah.
blah, blah, yeah.
Yeah. So these are actually containers within the containers. So there's an F packager and F fluent bit. Those are doing some of the logging stuff for you related to it. And then the ARS is the actual OS running the AR server. And that kind of leads to the next discussion. So in, let's see how this one looks in the slideshow. In this dashboard, you can actually what they call exec into the pod. So once you're exec into the pod, you're seeing the actual OS, just like you would with any normal OS. So you'll actually see the Tomcat directory on a mid-tier, and here this is AR system. So I went into opt BMC AR system and then DB. You see all your log files, everything is here. So you can actually do a VI or a tel or whatever on the log files. And if you're exec in, you can kind of do the same management that you're used to doing from a Linux perspective. But once you restart it, all these logs go away, you know, so it's kind of ephemeral that way. But this should all be stuff that you're used to recognizing. So, you know, it's still got the same AR error logs. It's still got the AR monitor logs, all of that kind of fun stuff still exists in the pod environment. And it's kind of the same directory structure once you're in the pod in order to make that happen. So, but this is, I wanted to show you platform user 0. So this is an actual AR server. And as you can see, it has all the stuff you'd normally expect from a normal AR server. You can also exec, like from a command line, you can run kubectl commands to exec in and actually get into one of these pods as well. I just like the Kubernetes dashboard. It's made, you know, for us GUI guys that are not as command line friendly, it makes life a little bit easier to do a lot of stuff. So I'll give you these slides, but here's instructions on how to get the dashboard and deploy the dashboard in your Kubernetes environment, and kind of set that up. The other kind of cool thing is support assist. So BMC has actually deployed this. This will be one of the things, again, that's exposed out on your ingress controller, where you can get into the logs. You can actually get the whole namespace logs, like everything in there, and download it. So these are all the different pods that it's kind of collecting in that namespace right now. So you got the assist tool, you've got the DWP Tomcat. So again, mid-tiers, you're wanting to, so you notice there's a user mid-tier, there's an integration mid-tier that stood up and running. OpenFire for your chat is kind of running in its own pods. Smart IT, you got a slave and a master down there at the bottom. So all of these are pods and all of these are logs. So you can actually just highlight the pod and then download all of the logs that are coming from that pod. So either at the namespace level, which would include everything here, or you can drill into an individual pod and download all of the logs to that pod. So in the example here, I've got platform FTS kind of selected. If I downloaded everything, it would have AR logs, AR error logs, or AR EMI logs, sorry, bin logs, int logs, and the temp logs. Or I can just click on the download and I'll download the AR logs, and that'll have everything in your normal DB directory kind of all zipped. And I took an example of that. So again, all the logs and stuff you guys are used to getting, it would have tarred it all up into that platform log, and then you can get your normal AR error log and all of that kind of fun stuff. So that's pretty much kind of what I wanted to go over, just some of the advantages, disadvantages, some of the lessons learned there. Hopefully that was a little bit helpful, but be glad to answer any questions that haven't been asked already. And
so,
again, hopefully that helps you guys out.
So Cade, Joe had one in the chat, and I'm going to paraphrase his thing just a little bit. Have you attempted to stand up a variant of this on a laptop or a desktop to be able to demo or something to that effect? And if so,
I have not,
what level of a hardware would you need to do that?
I don't think you could. I mean, there is a minimal install, but I have not seen any documentation on doing it on your own desktop, laptop. And I don't think it's going to be possible. Honestly, it's pretty resource intensive. It's installing. I mean, if you can imagine trying to run a mid-tier chat, Innovation Studio, the databases, everything on your laptop. Yeah, I just don't think there's probably too much there for you to be able to do on your own laptop. I mean, there is a compact install that reduces your requirements. But even that, I think you're probably looking at 20 or 30 CPU as a requirement. So I don't think your laptop's can handle it.
Have you noticed how much memory the pods are using? Is like one extremely large over the other?
So far they haven't hardly used anything. So the installer itself checks to make sure you've got enough CPU. CPU seems to be the big requirement to install. So it'll actually, if you're doing the normal install, it'll actually check and make sure you've got 150 CPU, I think is the check that it's doing. I haven't tried the minimal install to see if it's got a lower check on it, but and again, we haven't run it in full production yet, so there's hardly any load on it, and we really haven't seen it.
They mentioned
to be doing nothing at this point in time.
I saw mentioned in the documentation about an NFS server. Are you doing that as well?
An FS server?
NFS server?
NFS. So yeah, that was some confusion, and I tried to get BMC to kind of clarify this. There, for ITSM, there's not a requirement for NFS. I think there was originally a requirement for BHOM if you're doing the platform to have some NFS shares and persistent storage that way. But it sounds like with the later versions are kind of moving from that, away from that a little bit too. But that was one of my comments to BMC is, and especially when I was trying to do the bare metal install, we had a lot of questions, a lot of confusion around storage. How do I set up this? And BMC, and that's why I say you need to have a Kubernetes expert, because BMC is really not going to tell you how to stand up your infrastructure. They'll try and help you a little bit, but there's so many different ways you can stand it up that they can't provide that support. It's like them trying to tell your VM, tell you how to set up your VMware environment. It's going to be the same kind of thing for a Kubernetes. They're just going to say, here's the VMs we need. They're not going to say, here's how you set up your whole VMware environment and storage and stuff that way. So, but to answer the question, the short question, I don't think you need the NFS. You just need the persistent storage. And it needs to be, what do I want to call it? Block. I'd have to go back and look at my notes. Block level storage has got to be able to support the block level storage that way. So what are you guys trying to stand up, Matt? Are you trying to do bare metal, or what have you been?
Yeah, I was going to ask, I mean, looking at a couple different ways, I've looked at basically TANZU. I'm not a huge fan of TANZU so far, but I was kind of curious, maybe you give a little detail of the networking issues that you were encountering in the bare metal. I mean, I understand how you want a Pixie boot and they use horizontal autoscaler and that plays a lot into that. And I've been working through some issues with that, but I was wondering if that was kind of the.
So I haven't gotten far enough so far with the bare metal. So again, I'm hung up on the storage side of things with the bare metal.
Yeah.
And again, I'm even segregated on the bare metal side because I had another coworker stand up the bare metal servers. And we're actually trying, what is it called? It's a stripped down version of Kubernetes. It's not the full version of Kubernetes.
Like kind?
No.
K3S?
Maybe K3S. But so far that's been seeming to work okay. But again, I mean, there was no clear instructions on installing the ingress controller and stuff that way. I mean, my cluster seems to be okay. I haven't had any issues installing that, but we have struggled quite a bit with the persistent storage and trying to get that to talk to our storage environment and set that up correctly. And like I said, I'm hoping to try and run the platform install again and get the pods to deploy and see if that works. But I wasn't involved in the actual Kubernetes stand up, so I can't give you a whole lot of advice on that side.
Okay, thank you.
But, and again, this may just be my perception because I wasn't doing all of the VMware work, and the VMware guys did have to get VMware on the hook to figure out their networking stuff from the VMware side. And this customer did have a lot of segregation requirements, like they want dev totally segregated from prod, totally segregated from test, internally kind of scenarios. And then they wanted their databases on a totally different VLAN. So I think it might have been a little bit more complex than some, but it did take them a little while to get that all figured out and stood up. And so from my perspective, it was fairly painless because they did all the work, but they did have to do quite a bit of work around that. But I don't think they had to do as much on the storage side as we were running into with the bare metal. Okay, other questions? I don't want to run forever on this meeting, but if there's questions, glad to address them.
Cade, I tell you, we really appreciate you coming on and talking this stuff because, like I say, we're going through that process right now. Matt's working real hard over there trying to figure it out from the sysadmin side, and then once we get that in place, I got to figure it out from the remedy admin side and everything with it. And of course, we're doing it with an existing system and going to have to use the data manager to move everything over and all that stuff. And that's a whole nother level of questions and stuff to get into down the road and everything. So I really appreciate you coming in and making this
I
presentation.
think the data management side is probably documented a little bit better, and that I'm not as concerned about that side, but I can definitely tell you the platform. So the Kubernetes environment, that's generally a learning curve for your hosting and whoever's providing your hosting or whatever. And then it'll be a learning curve for you too on the deployment side, just to how to use it once they give you a Kubernetes platform. So I agree with that.
Exactly. Any other questions? Phil, I saw you had your hand up for a minute. Do you still have a question?
Oh, no, I was giving Cade applause for his great presentation. That's what the two hands were. Thanks,
Well,
Cade.
so it was kind of thrown together a little bit, but hopefully that was helpful.